Today, we're joined by the eminent Nigel Swycher as we explore his journey from attorney at one of London's top firms to entrepreneur and founder of Cipher, an AI-driven IP analytics startup. In our conversation, recorded just last month, he shares about this exciting time in his career as he looks towards a new phase following the 2023 acquisition of Cipher by LexisNexis. I invite you to discover how a chance conversation in a Canadian jacuzzi led to Cipher's formation and future successes. Nigel discusses his transition from a rigorous practice as a partner in a law firm to startup life, the importance of working with the right people and integrating law with business and technology, and leveraging data for strategic decisions. As the legal field evolves with AI, and the whole world, Nigel offers insights on how lawyers can innovate and redefine their roles. I especially am grateful that Nigel was willing to go a bit deeper and share perspectives on bringing one's full self to leadership roles, a perspective that has been earned through much hard work and success at an extremely high level. Whether you're an IP practitioner diving into analytics, a legal professional considering a change, or an aspiring entrepreneur, this episode provides inspiration and insights for embracing new opportunities. Tune in to be inspired by Nigel's passion for reinvention and learning. Welcome to Field Notes from Abroad, intersectional conversations centering around intellectual property, communicating across differences, and well-being as professionals living and working around the globe. I'm Laura Gisler, a U.S. patent attorney. I've lived and worked as an attorney in Sweden, Copenhagen, and now the U.S. Nigel, great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for making some time to be here and to talk with us. Good to have you. How are you?
No, I'm honored. I'm so used to being on the other side of the microphone that I'm feeling a slight bit of trepidation, but I'm sitting tightly and I'm ready for what you've got for me, Laura.
Exactly. And for those of you who don't know Nigel, he's referring to his maybe one of the very original IP podcasts, Cipher Vision, which then turned into LexisNexis Evolving IP, or it merged with some others and became LexisNexis Evolving IP. Is that right, Nigel?
Yeah, very good. Okay. An odd place to start a podcast promoting my other podcast, but let's go with it.
Perfect. Jumping right in. Maybe before we get to your career as a podcaster, we can speak a little bit about your profession and kind of just how you got started. First as a lawyer and then as an entrepreneur and then as someone who has successfully sold their company and exited properly.
Yeah, so that might make for a conversation in two parts. I had 25 years as an IP lawyer, so all I've ever done is IP. So we'll have a narrative here, but there was a break, and then there was 2013 when I set up Cipher as an analytics company. So conventional lawyer in the UK, that's a solicitor. We have this kind of split profession: those who wear wigs and those who don't wear wigs. I was a non-wig wearing lawyer. I was a solicitor, worked for a major law firm, Slaughter and May. I led up their IP team until I didn't love it anymore. And then I decided to make a change to do that entrepreneur thing.
And can we talk a little bit about that change? I think that's always really interesting because a lot of, especially in the IP space, I think a lot of the work that we're doing is a little entrepreneurial, but still the change from working in a firm, even if you're a partner or an owner, to starting your own company, especially something in patent analytics, especially in like AI before AI was the only thing we ever talked about. That seems to be a big jump. That seems to be a big transition. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and look, I'm living proof that lawyers can be entrepreneurs, and I think lawyers do get a bad reputation for being very risk averse. The job of a classical lawyer is to eliminate risk, and no business has ever been successful on the elimination of risk bandwagon. So moving from the elimination of risk to the managing of risk is I think a big change, but it can be done. And, I think you just said in the question that lawyers do have that ability to be entrepreneurial. They don't sit there reading out legal advice as if there's some ivory tower. So I think the best lawyers are lawyers who deeply immerse himself into business, really understand the issues. Now, of course, you've come from a world where you personally have been an in-house lawyer, and now you're working for a consultancy, an outside counsel. So, internal lawyers, inside lawyers, general counsel have been business people for many years, but I think it's been slower coming for the legal community as a whole and the IP world as a whole, but it's definitely evolved. And for me, I'm not saying the change was easy. I'm not saying the change was natural, but I made the change, and provided you follow a few fundamentals, I think it's a really fascinating journey.
Nice. And can we get a few more details on that? So you're having this very sterling career, I imagine, as a solicitor. And then you just have this idea, you're chatting with some friends, you're chatting with your family, or what was driving the change? I think anything that you would be willing to share would be really
Well,
interesting.
look, I mean, number one, it wasn't some kind of Damascus moment where, oh, let's stop being a lawyer. I think I'll set up a startup.
Okay.
So I left the law after 20 years at Slaughter and May. And then I went to America to live in La Jolla. And I didn't do that for any other reason than I really needed a break. Not some kind of midlife crisis, but to become a partner in a major law firm then and now, for that matter, it's a tough gig. And you can do it for as long as you love it. And as soon as you stop loving it, you need to ask yourself, well, basically one question: is the money so good that you'll put up with misery, or at least some degree of suboptimality? Or will you make a change? And that was the conversation with my family. And they voted very clearly that it would be quite nice to know who our father was, or it would be quite nice to know who my husband was. And so that was a very clear decision. So I took a year out and went to La Jolla. I sort of did some sort of work for Quinn Emanuel, but really, generally, I was teaching in the school or teaching sport or surfing, but not the internet, real surfing with my yellow Jeep. And then I came back. And at that point, it was, now, what do I really want to do if it's not that? So I tried lawyer again, and I realized that it wasn't that. And I set up a consultancy, which was called Tangential. And that was basically trying to eliminate all the drudgery of law with the sort of several hundred documents in a single transaction and get to the essence of strategy. So clients who had been very loyal, or I'd been very loyal to them, they'd been very loyal to me, like Arm and British Aerospace. And they all said, well, fine, we all have strategic questions. Why don't you come and work with us? Symbian, which was a joint venture doing mobile phone devices before the world was taken over by Android. So I did all these kind of really interesting projects, but in every project I did, I came across a brick wall. If I was doing IP insurance, I needed data. If I was doing lending against IP assets, I needed data. If I was doing indemnity profiles in patent licensing, I needed data. And whilst there was a lot of data around, patent data, as it happens, has been digitized for 50 plus years. None of it was accessible to the professional. And so this kind of journey through the law, through strategy, took me to this moment where I realized the world needed to, well, the IP world needed to have access to high quality analyzed data, what's now called analytics. Well, it's called analytics, by the way, in every other business area, whether it be law or it be engineering or it be marketing or it be energy consumption. But hard to believe, in 2013, there was no business-centric IP product.
Wow. Okay. So that's 2013 that you're having these thoughts and these conversations as a result of the work that you've been doing.
Exactly that year.
Nice. Thank you so much for sharing that. And also about the La Jolla year. I think I've talked with so many professionals, and I think maybe even increasingly these days, or perhaps just where I'm at in my profession, where folks are looking to make some sort of change. I think professions are less and less. You start at one firm and you move through the ranks all the way up, and then you retire from there, and more either folks hopping around or just making some pivots. So I think it's really valuable to hear the journey that you went on there, because I think
No, and it's a really important
yeah.
point. These legal careers, IP careers, are tough. And if you're not enjoying it, then you've got to ask yourself the question, can I keep on doing it? And I think the legal training, I think intellectual property training, certainly with what intellectual property is today, is so integrated into business and technology that there are other opportunities. In the same way, there's opportunities for people to come into IP who haven't got sort of bar school training, that haven't got science training. That barrier of moving out of IP, or that barrier to move into IP, is really down. And so I would encourage anyone who's not getting from it what they want to imagine what else they might do.
Yeah. Thank you for highlighting that. And also talking about the lower barrier of entry too, because I think that's something that we're hearing more and more in the US too, about how you can access this profession, which is for many, can be fantastic and like full of so many different challenges, and you can grow in so many directions. But historically, it's been you must be a particular type of engineer, and then you must be a lawyer, and then you can have a profession. Otherwise, you can be in merely a support role. But now I think we're starting to see a lot more diversity of roles and backgrounds having a really valuable place. Much and thanks to, I think, some of this analytics work. So back to that 2030
and AI. I don't really want to go and take the whole conversation towards artificial intelligence, but I think we should go and at least put a marker down.
Yeah.
These barriers are being impacted by AI and certainly the generative AI explosion.
Yes, absolutely. Good. Anything more that we want to say about that? You feel comfortable just mentioning? Let's mention it. Let's keep going. We can come back to it if we need to. But okay, so you've got this great idea, like, or at least seeing there's a need here. We need to be doing something. What happens next?
Well, an idea and £2.20. Sorry, we have an international audience, and $3 will buy you a cappuccino. So there isn't really much in an idea. And I think a lot of ideas just go out of the window. You just sit on them. And I think I probably wouldn't have done anything about it. I was frustrated and I couldn't progress with some of my projects. But you can't suddenly just invent the solution. And then there is a famous story about a jacuzzi in Canada where I sat with a very good friend, Scott, and I went, I've got this amazing idea. And he said, well, we're drinking a beer in a jacuzzi, so there's clearly a beer mat at hand, and some random came by and gave us a pen, and he said, well, sketch it out if you think you can explain it. So we've got soggy beer mat, and said, well, look, it seems like a really good idea, so what's stopping you? So I said, well, I don't have any data to analyze, and I don't have any funding. And he put out his hand and he said, well, you do now. And he agreed to match any funding I was willing to put in. And so we came out with even when sober, we came out with this very firm idea that I would give it a go. And just to talk numbers, we both agreed to put in £250,000. So we had £500,000 to give it a go. Still didn't solve the data problem, but it definitely solved the moving off the stasis of being an idea.
Yeah.
So I think that's what you need. You need to ultimately get enough momentum where what you want to be true becomes true. And that was the Cipher story. But step one is to take you off zero. If it was snakes and ladders, to get yourself off that starting point.
Nice. Okay. So you're funded. You're embracing the wellness scene, it sounds like. And then you're ready to get going. What happens next? So do you mind walking us through this whole journey? I think this is really interesting.
Well, there are many of my children who won't necessarily agree. So feel free to stop me at any point, okay? Because I have a lot to say on this topic. I'm sure I've seen your questions. So you have a lot of other questions. But I mentioned the data point. If you think about analytics, you've got a data layer, and then you've got some analysis, and then you've got some insight. And no one really pays for data anymore because it's somewhat of a commodity. But it's only a commodity if you have it. So, for example, you could download the United States patent records, taking all patents from the beginning of time. Provided your laptop was big enough, you could probably have done that by the end of day. So it's not hard to get the data. But having it in a structured, organized way into families, let's not go about what a patent family is, but there's a lot of organization, ownership. And I had been working with Thomson Reuters, the business that's now Clarivate, one of the market leaders. And I'd been dealing with a guy, and I said to him, you know what? It's amazing. You have these set of products, but you've got nothing for the person working in strategy. You're helping people file another patent, but that's not doing strategic analysis of any sort. And the conversation went on, and he said, well, if you think you're so smart, why don't you do it? To which my reply was, I don't have the data. And the Cipher changing moment, the life-changing moment was he put out his hand and said, well, you do now. And we were the first company in the world that ever took a license of the entirety of the Thomson Reuters data set.
Wow. Okay. And then started making things happen. Because I remember I met you in person like 2019, I think, Paris, prepping for the stage there. And you were well underway. I don't know if you had the name change to Cipher yet, but otherwise, you were working in this space. You had the product.
So right, 2000. This is all happening quickly. The one thing that I'll never be accused of is procrastination. So I've had my beer in Canada. I've now had my meeting with Dave Brown in.
You've got your funding. You've got your data. Now what?
Data. We set up the company.
Okay.
We set up the company in September 2013. It turns out that I needed a data scientist, which was another story. I was introduced to my co-founder, Steve Harris, who had been working in financial analytics and had sold his company and was ready for his fresh challenge. And Steve Harris is he is a genius, which is kind of useful, but it is also the best working relationship I've ever had with anyone in my whole life. So we argued every day for the next 11 years and never fell out.
Wow.
And that really was the catalyst. Yeah. I now had a fundable proposition. So I had the initial funding or the agreement for initial funding, but you can't get very far on $500,000. I now had the data, and now I had my co-founder. By 2019, we were probably on like version 3, right? We launched the first. We got the first revenue was January the 1st, 2015, which was a license to Arm, a company that's now gone through many iterations, but is now a public company, being a market leader in semiconductors. So that was the journey. Beer, data, co-founder, go.
Great, good. And then just magic, I guess, moving forward, and then merging with or selling to LexisNexis. Was that the?
That would be the fast forward button from heaven, right? So the fact that you can get a company launched isn't quite the same as the scaling and ultimate divestment. You've already given away the punchline. We did sell. No secret, right? Cipher sold to LexisNexis in 2023, but that's a full 10 years. It's a full 10 years with 5 rounds of funding, many versions of the product, many pivots or focusing, but certainly not a straight line. I mean, it might seem blindingly obvious to Laura 2025 that launching an AI analytics product to the patent world a really good idea because there's a lot of products out there today which are doing exactly that. But I think we were really close to being regarded as the Antichrist. When we walked
Yeah.
into patent offices and said, or walked into companies and said, we have an AI powered machine that just kind of figures it all out.
Yep.
And a lot of education as to why AI can be trusted and why and how AI can take on these very significant challenges, which now seem ordinary in 2025, but didn't seem ordinary at all back then.
And can we talk about that a little bit? Because I think that, one of the goals of this podcast, or kind of one of the themes, is communicating across differences. And I think what you were doing back then of introducing a new technology, a new idea, a new way of working, a lot of new, I think, to an audience that may or may not have been very open to it, is something that folks in the IP space, across roles, probably run into. And I think humans in general these days, or probably all days, are running into, of just how we're, um, not selling, not bringing people on board, but how are we communicating these new ideas in ways that help people understand, and also help us understand them better.
Yeah. And so I think the summary to everything I believe in this is silo busting.
Mm.
If you think about intellectual property, you already, if you're in the IP world, you're sort of asking yourself, are you a patent attorney, or are you a litigator, or are you doing licensing? Where I don't see that silo at all. I probably have never seen it as clearly as the IP purists, but certainly by the time I'm founding Cipher, I'm passionately on a mission to bust all silos. So Bo Hayden puts it brilliantly. He heads up, as you know, one of the leading European courses in IP strategy in Gothenburg, and he talks about T-shaped people. He talks about the ability to take an individual and train them on a trilogy of law, business, and technology. And if you can keep on saying those words often enough until they begin to blend, that's where you have the perfect merging of IP into the business where it belongs, but certainly you then have the Cipher narrative. We're not only saying to IP people, would you like to go and adopt AI? Because we know what their answer would be. Of course we wouldn't. That would mean change. And what's the point of change if it's working fine as it is? But I think you'll find impatience in many other parts of that triangle. You do have lawyers under increasing pressure from the business. They have increasing challenges from technology. I've already mentioned AI. 40% of legal jobs are going to be impacted by the next generation of AI technologies. So the lawyer can no longer sit there like King Canute and say, the tide will never wet my feet. We know that it will. So, education for me was about silo busting. Success was about successfully silo busting, to no longer to be obsessed with talking the language of IP, but to talk the language of business. And that means you can start with why. I mean, like, why do you need a product like Cipher? Well, you need a product like Cipher. Otherwise, you won't be able to answer all the questions like how many patents are enough, or how do you mitigate risk. You can't solve those problems unless you're willing to be different to a traditional, I don't know what the extreme is. Someone who files patents all day long, and the only thing they're interested in is taking the invention disclosure and progressing that to a granted patent. If that's your world, then I think you should look up. But there are many, many other people. The visionaries were all to be found on the west coast of America. The Googles, the Metas, the Nvidia. They bought our product even when it wasn't really that good, and they said, "Keep on going." You know, the world, the marketplace needs that.
That's great. Thank you, Nigel, for just like I, you were you were there through so much of this, and it sounds like you were having these conversations, um, so early on before now. I think so many of us are having these conversations, right? But I think it sounds like you were having them and you were getting traction and you had an audience, you found an audience that believed in you, and your product and the work that you were doing, before the rest of, I guess, the culture kind of caught on, even if it was the IP culture. So really grateful to hear that. Can you speak a little bit about some of your, like personally as a professional, like challenges and the things that you found, you really enjoyed or easeful, in the entrepreneurial journey? And also just in scaling the business. I don't want to jump over. We're kind of jumping over it because there's no way I can fit your whole like professional trajectory in this chat. But I do think, yeah, getting some of those highlights of just like what the experience was like for you would be really great.
Yeah. So the story I tell, or have told, is about calling in favors. Building a company is very much a team sport. So any idea that these things are done alone should be just forgotten immediately. Uh, and in my legal career, I guess I'd been a generous soul. I tried to help others along the way, and therefore I knew a lot of people in the sector. So the genius that was Cipher, apart from Steve Harris, was the fact that I'd been in the market a long time. I always admire / amazed by people who start companies in a sector where they have no background. I definitely knew about IP, and I definitely knew a lot of people, and I called in a virtually infinite number of favors. And to my surprise, they all said yes. I can't think of somebody I rang up and said, I need your help. And they went, why should I help you? You're a startup. And it was like, of course. And I think people like you, Laura, are kind of like the next generation of that. You are collaborative, you do reach out, you do have a community, you are highly respected, but you give and you take in equal measure, which is why your this podcast has got off to a great start with really fine contributors, because people are really glad to give back. So for anyone who's starting out in a different career, I would say call in all of the favors. People will be delighted to help. So that was my number one learning, I think. The second thing is, as a lawyer, we've already said lawyers can make great entrepreneurs, but they don't know a lot. So I didn't know most of the things I needed to know in order to build a successful company. For example, I didn't know any data science, so that was a bit of a problem. So you solve that problem by finding a co-founder who does. But those Achilles heel, there are more than two of them. There's 100 of them. You're an Achilles centipede with lots of Achilles heels. So be sure that you build the right team, whether it be on finance or it be on marketing or it be on sales. I mean, the list is very long. And when I say I got lucky, I mean, you work very hard to build the right team, but you do need the right sort of luck. So think hard about calling in favors, and think really hard, and recognize your own. The great thing about me is I absolutely recognize my weaknesses. I have this enormous amount of confidence that I will succeed, but I was also aware that I wouldn't be able to do it unless I filled the gaps in my centipedal architecture. I don't know how long we can keep on talking about this centipede.
I love it.
but unless I filled the team with really high quality individuals, and those needs change. They change as the company goes through different phases, and you've got to be able to continually make team changes, which means letting go of people who have been incredibly loyal but can't make it to the next stage. And we haven't really talked about the LexisNexis acquisition particularly, but there's a time where, I realized as the Cipher CEO, the management realized that it was time to let the scaling be done by somebody who is more used to scaling.
Yeah, and let's talk about that. First of all, how big was the team when you were starting to think through seriously or look through what an exit would look like?
About 40.
40. Okay, nice. And I'm hearing like the mindset, being generous, which is, I think, just very obviously part of who you are. But did you just find somebody great in HR? Did you pull on your network? Initially, what did finding those outside of this magic connection with your co-founder? I love that. Outside of that, what did that look like?
Um,
To the
a
extent that
game
you can speak.
of a very multi-dimensional game of tag.
Okay.
So you obviously need funding when you set up a company, and you obviously do many rounds of what's called family and friends, i.e.,
Yep.
those rounds which you do without professional money. So we brought in our venture capital money at about year 5, so must have been at 2018-ish. So we had a need for quite a lot of money before that point. And we used to say we didn't want any money from somebody who could only bring money. And so pretty much every investor in Cipher became a sort of either a formal or an informal advisor, certainly a supporter, certainly an introducer. So everyone brought in somebody.
Nice.
And so Scott Bell, who was Jacuzzi Man at the beginning of this podcast, he brought in at one point a guy called Steve Halliday. Steve Halliday had been the chairman of a very successful, multi-billion pound exit. And he ultimately, he became an investor, then he became an advisor. We had an advisory board, and then he became our chairman. And he introduced me to the people who ultimately became our head of research, our head of marketing, and our chief revenue officer, our third director, Stuart. So you can see this game of tag that he comes on, he gets involved, he then changes his role. He then realizes that for the next stage, because he's done it before and I haven't, he realizes you need to professionalize the organization. And I would say it was people like Steve and the board at the time who realized at about year 10 that it was going to be really hard to continue this kind of. We didn't really have that much financing in our whole time, which meant growth was quite slow, quite steady, quite considered, but nothing like a sort of a US unicorn. So we were running a risk that we were growing. We were growing at about 30%, but ideally you want to be growing at 50 or 60 or more. So that was going to require a lot more money. So you're either going to get it from private equity or you're going to get it as a total exit to trade. And so it was quite clear. I remember you've got employees who are not being paid necessarily full market price, but are getting options. We haven't really, and I know this isn't a podcast about options, but options are hugely attractive. But they only are hugely attractive if you can actually cash them in at some point. And cashing them in doesn't mean selling them on a stock exchange, because I'm sure all of your listeners are aware that private companies don't have a market for the shares. So you're going to need an event. And that event is either a private equity financing or a trade exit.
Nice. And so then LexisNexis. Actually, you know what? Before we jump into that, can we talk about the Cipher pod? Because that was still happening while you were under the Cipher umbrella.
Yeah. So our head of marketing, Francesca Lavoie, who was the podcast host, she brought the idea. Her and her team said, we've got to think of other ways of letting. The thing about Cipher is we were incredibly authentic. It wasn't like I spoke about my admiration for people who start businesses where they have no background. That's admirable, adventurous, risky, but there's no authenticity. You can't go and say, well, I was born into patents if you weren't. But I was sort of well into my 30th year in the sector. And so our differentiator was we really, really understood and cared about the problems. We probably cared as much about the problems as we did about our product. And so all the people we were surrounding ourselves, whether it was David Kapos, the former head of the USPTO, or Bo Hayden, who was in education, or Jonathan Haskell, who was writing books like Capitalism Without Capital. These were our community of people we were talking to every day. And it just became obvious that these were conversations that other people should hear. And so at that time, podcasts were exploding. It became obvious that we should literally take these conversations from the industry because we had the contacts. It was also a bit of a USP, right? No one else had quite the same community
Right.
in the commercial world as we did. Lots of lawyers have good communities and lots of great clients. Lots of patent attorneys have great communities, but we were a bit weird. We were a commercial entity selling data, but with this phenomenal ecosystem. So we turned it into a thing, which became Cipher Vision, as you said at the top of the hour. Also became Evolving IP when it was acquired by LexisNexis.
Nice. Thank you. And we will be sure to link that because I think you did put together some excellent series that really highlight the cross-functional nature of IP. I think a lot of what you've been talking about of those what Bo's class and the three pillars, and just really speaking to experts who are bringing unique perspectives on things that are still very relevant, I think, if you're in the IP space, but also really interesting if you're outside of the IP space, but interacting with it in so many of the different capacities that folks do run across it. So,
I think, I mean, that's perfectly a reasonable thing to do in the notes to this podcast, not least because it double underlines the word silo busting. You talk to some people and you say, well, how would you defeat the risk of non-practicing entities, which are those companies that buy patents in order to exploit them again? And then you hear about Lot Network and the work that Ken Seddon's doing. But it all just seems mysterious if it's not your world. So you've moved from litigation, which you might know a lot about, to non-practicing entities, which might be a term you don't feel very comfortable about, to license on transfer, which you've probably never heard about, and the ecosystem that's built around the Lot Network. Well, these podcasts are 20 minutes. Not this one, but my ones were 20
a
minutes.
little
And
long-winded over here. Sorry.
yeah, they were 20 minutes, and what a great primer. And so I actually thought they were great for this new generation of IP people, not lawyers, the people who were working at the intersection of IP technology and business to access other topics and get rid of that layer of embarrassment and fear that comes from simply never heard of OIN or Lot Network or AST or RPX or some other three-letter acronym which will have grown up. And so we had after 3-4 series, we had 40 episodes worth of stuff that you could just reach into.
Thanks for that. Yeah. So primer, I really like that. Feels like open source, practical university for folks who are touching IP.
Yeah.
Really nice. Thank you for that. And thank you for that contribution. Truly. And now what's next? Because now the LexisNexis chapter happened briefly. Do you want to speak to that, or that felt like kind of just the end of your role in Cipher and what you'd been building?
Yeah. So, I mean, you sell and then you stay. So I stayed with the organization for 18 months to ensure the staff transition, client transition, brand transition, integration, all those entirely necessary things happen. And then it's ordained, it's agreed right at the start what that timeline will look like, and you leave, and that period came to an end on the 31st of December 2024. So depending on when this podcast comes out, we are pretty fresh on the other side of post LexisNexis.
Yes. And Nigel, I have to admit, so Nigel and I actually had this conversation or a similar conversation a few months back, and there were some technical difficulties. So we're rehaving the conversation, but we're having it now on this side. When we spoke initially, you were still part of LexisNexis and kind of reflecting. We spoke briefly about either what was coming next or what matters next, but now you're in it, and I know it still all probably feels very, like you said, very fresh and very new. But do you have your feet underneath you? Are you figuring out which direction you want to run next, or rest next in, or either professionally or just personally? Where are you headed? What does life look like from that very unique world that I think so few of us will get to be in.
Yeah. So I don't think it's any secret to say that I'm 62, and 62 is young in a 2025. So I'm sure there are lots of people listening going, no, 62, that's my dad's age. That's definitely not young. But there has to be a next. The idea that I could go from whatever we've discussed around my legal career, which was definitely full on, to Cipher, which was definitely full on, to LexisNexis, which was intense and full on, to you can't go to nothing. Well, I'm not sure I've done very much this year, but you put your feelers out. You've got to reinvent yourself again. Well,
Yeah.
I hope you got the impression from this conversation that reinventing myself is what I love, right? So I'm not sad to be reinventing myself. I couldn't be happier. So I reached out to just about everyone, and anyone who's listening who wants to go and talk to me about what I might do next, they should let me know. But it's almost certainly going to be a blend. It's going to be this kind of pluralist, whatever the right expression is, the idea that you no longer have to devote yourself to one thing obsessively. I mean, that's the word that I think my career has got. This Nigel was obsessive. He was single-minded about his legal career. He was single-minded about his Cipher career. I think I'd like to think I will not be single-minded in whatever comes to unfold. There'll almost certainly be some teaching in the area of IP. The idea was that Cipher Vision and Evolving IP was meant to get rid of any risk that I would leave the profession and the sector with things I knew that could help. But the profession is doing so well at the moment. Intellectual property now sits at the heart of so much. I still think there are some things I can do with people like Bo and people like Durham University and Gothenburg and some courses in Berkeley where there'll be some ways of me getting involved to continue to give back. This invitation on the podcast in many ways is a little bit of that.
Yeah.
I just like talking about how IP has changed and why it's important and why the journey hasn't yet finished. So I think a level of education of getting it into, the sub 30-year-olds is exactly where I want to work. After that, maybe you're a little bit more set in your ways, but before that, you're just hungry for all the direction and ideas and randomness that you can give. So whether it be undergrad or whether it be postgraduate work or whether it be strategy education for policymakers or corporates, I definitely think I have a role to play there. And then the other one is I had the most fantastic, lucky, but definitely fantastic time for 10, 11 years building Cipher. And it is an element of luck because, I don't know, 1 in 10 companies succeed, and Cipher succeeded. But then you become sort of this survivor bias that, oh, Nigel's a successful entrepreneur, or I got lucky, or I learned some stuff along the way. I'd like to give that one back to one or more startups by maybe taking a non-exec role or a chairman role. What Steve Halliday, who I mentioned earlier, did for Cipher. I'd love to be able to do for others what Scott Bell did in Jacuzzi. I would love to be able to do that for another. So I think there'll almost certainly be a chunk of education, a chunk of investment / advisory roles there. And then, because we're only February, spoiler alert, this was recorded in February, there's plenty of time for the rest of the year to unfold. And I'm sure there'll be one or more things. Plus, self-evidently, the luxury of a little bit more time for family, myself. I think we spoke when we were prepping. I'm building this house in Devon by the water. I've always wanted to live by the water, and thank you, LexisNexis, I now can. So I've now got I've now been able to build a house. So that one will be finished by the end of the year. So there'll be some changes to not working 5 days a week. So you can hopefully still do these other things, but have a little bit more time.
Yes. Oh, well deserved, well earned, and I'm really glad to hear about all of this. I'll look forward to seeing who those lucky students are across the board and the startups too, of course. But I just think you would be, your work on the Cipher pod. You're such a clear instructor and so obviously passionate and knowledgeable about what you do that it would be such a treat to I'm going to try and take your class is what I'm saying. Okay. But that, how did you pause? Okay. How did you tell us about, now we're diving into well-being, because not everyone, even if you have um, a successful first and second career, you don't always come out of it joyful and generous and excited to give back. How'd you take care of yourself during this time? I know you surrounded yourself with great people. I think that's hugely important. Finding that to be increasingly important. But I think a lot of folks who are um, in the phase where they are in their obsessive mindset about their career, they are highly driven, and the days and the weeks seem to fly by in the pursuit of X, Y, or Z goal. I think they would benefit greatly from hearing how someone who's made it through now, at least through a couple phases, what that looked like, what your day-to-day looked like, either like morning routine, if you have things you swear by there, or just in general, how you kept things. I don't even want to say balanced, because I think that that's not something that I've ever been able or that I've seen work on like a day-to-day basis, but like, how'd you keep it, not even keep it together, but how did you enjoy life during that time?
Yeah, well, look, clearly not everyone gets it right all the time, and I'm no exception to that. I think I definitely got Cipher more right than I got my legal career.
Hmm.
So, uh, but I also don't, if you go back to 40 years ago since I qualified as a lawyer, so we're going back a while, mental health awareness was a different type of topic. Like it was more Darwinian than that at the law firm. How did you know the people who could become partners? Well, they were the ones who were still standing
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
still smiling. So I definitely think that you could tag my career number one as resilience, but you have to make some sacrifices. I also talked openly in this podcast about the just stopping.
Mm.
And I remember, I was surrounded by people who said, "Oh my God, you're so brave," but it was self-evidently the right decision. I was giving up a very successful legal career with no plan for what was on the other side, but I knew that I could go no further with that career. So that's a bit brutal, right? If the only way you can solve the problem at hand is to give it up.
Mm.
Whereas
Yeah.
I think in today's society where mental health is more open and you can talk about it, then I would like to go and think that the Nigel then would have been talked through that apex, that nadir, whatever it was, but
Mm.
that breaking point, and they would have held on to me, and I'd have had a career which would have continued in the law. As it happens, I'm not sorry, right? Because it all turned out great, and I got this other career as an entrepreneur. But the jokes that we have around when we talk about this now is that I definitely stopped and smelt the roses in the Cipher journey.
Mm.
I sort of enjoyed every moment and savored it, was surrounded by my directors, my employees, and it was very much, I was building a company. We were building a company around my own value system. It wasn't like I was working for a law firm that had been around for 100 years where the values were already well ingrained. So, but the top tip I would give across it all is, I don't know if everyone's had counseling nowadays, but I've certainly had counseling.
Mm.
And the mistake I made in career number one was two Nigels. I'm a very sensitive soul. I like to build meaningful relationships and friendships. And I persuaded myself that not all of those values and personality traits were welcome in the law. So I built a very arrogant, certainly a very confident exterior, because that's what City of London law required at the time. Supreme confidence, always on, never a chink in the armor. And that's quite brutal on your soul if you decide to maintain two versions of yourself, the one that your children see at home and the one that your counterparties see at work. And that's incredibly damaging. So anyone who's on that gig of having got two versions themselves, I would ask them to reflect whether that's sustainable. It wasn't for me. And I then went through this period of counseling, which was roughly about the same time as I set up Cipher. And his advice, I'm sure there was lots of advice, but the one that stood out for me is, Nigel, there must only be one Nigel. And I have to say that that brought joy to my work. It made me more accessible. Certainly, it made me less ferocious. And now I can still be professional, but I can still have a personality. I can still want to get a good price on a product, but I can still spend time talking about the human side. So that was the biggest change of all, was going from this two Nigels to one Nigel. And it worked for me.
Wow, that's powerful. Thank you for sharing all of that. I know I personally can relate to that, and I've spoken to so many folks who that integration of how we bring our full selves to work and yet still be highly professional and highly successful. I think is thankfully I see it more and more being spoken about and being space being allowed for different personalities and different strengths in a workplace, even a legal workplace. But yeah, I think that's a challenge that many folks will relate to. So thank you so much for sharing so candidly about that. And I am greatly appreciative that you did go through that work too, because I feel that the person that I met in 2019 and continue to interact with is the sensitivity comes through, the care, the generosity comes through, as well as the brilliance and everything else that I think is a little bit more maybe obvious from the resume or from a conversation in the legal space. So thank you for that. Anything else, Nigel, that you feel we should be talking about here? Did we skip over anything? And we skipped over so much. But I think, that generosity piece has come through, and I'm not asking you to tell me how generous you are in your life and time. I think that has come across very well here, and will continue in the next years as we see how your career in this reinvention evolves and develops. But I would just love to hear anything else that's coming up for you, either personally or professionally, as you reflect on these now like two careers that you've had, these two maybe even more phases, and move towards this new future.
Look, the conversation sort of turned sufficiently real that maybe going back to AI and generative AI, this isn't that podcast. But for those people who are listening to this podcast who are in that AI world, just wondering the right way to look upon AI, I certainly want to get across the clear message, which I believe in and almost certainly will be engaged in the years to come, which is helping lawyers and the IP profession engage with AI in a responsible way, in an effective way. None of this nonsense about, AI writing pleadings or briefs for court and hallucinating citations. I'm not asking for that nonsense, but I am asking the profession to engage, because the benefits are going to be significant, but the changes that are going to happen to the legal profession are going to be profound.
And what do you think some of those are going to be? If you were, either what you're seeing now or what you would be predicting in terms of what those changes are going to look like, or how folks could be preparing themselves, yes, figuring out the technology and actually trying to think about how this might work. But
Yeah.
yeah, any
I mean,
thoughts on
so stay calm is obviously the one which I would say to everyone. We've been through relatively significant changes, even in my lifetime, whether it be the internet or open source, or I mean, there's digitization generally, connectivity generally. So we know that there are massive changes that change the way we think about work and law and IP. But this one is profound, and it will affect. Sticking with the Goldman Sachs report, 40% of all jobs. Now, that either causes fear and protectionism while you just try and hold on to what you've got and hope that it's somebody else's problem, or it's opportunity, which is 40% of jobs are going to go, but that's only line one of the report. In the same way as if you were, I don't know, a stable boy in the day of the horse car transition, that stable boy might have then the next day become the person holding the red flag who walked in front of the car, or might have been the person who moved tires from one location to another. There's always going to be that relocation, that change, and that would be the area I'd ask everyone to think about, which is how is the legal profession going to change,
Yeah.
and what opportunities are there, and how does the legal profession, the IP profession, prepare for that? And I think the punchline is going to be, if you take a law firm in 2035 and compare it in terms of structure to 2025, we kind of veered past this point about diversity and inclusion. But when I talk about diversity, I think it's going to be diversity of roles. I think within most law firms are 50-50, half lawyers, half support staff. I think you'll find now that you'll end up with this change yet again, that there'll be people doing data and analysis to change the way law is delivered. Mm-hmm. And that's a massive opportunity for people in law and business to come into the legal and IP profession to make those changes. But it's definitely a wake-up call for the law firms to start thinking about how they re-engineer their law firm to allow these different roles to influence and impact the work we do today. Anyway, I don't know whether this was on your agenda, but I did want to give a shout out for the impact of AI.
Oh, I'm so glad you did. And I think that message of stay calm and then let's work on loosening our grip on keeping everything the way it is probably resonant across the board, and definitely in the AI space, and also just in general changes.
Yeah, and you just hear too many people saying, but it doesn't work. And if we didn't have the kindness of the west coast of America saying to us, "No, Nigel, it doesn't work, but we think it will," then there would be no Cipher. And I wonder what impact it would have had on the new generation of AI tools that have come forward. Yeah. So the same message I give to the profession now. Sure, there are things that are in their early days, and many of those aren't the best version of themselves yet. But with your support and engagement, they can become that. And the opposite doesn't bear thinking about, that you just ignore them until they become the best version, and then you're behind the eight ball because everyone else has adopted it and you haven't, and then you're just another Polaroid camera or another Kodak film or another person who missed the tech revolution that would have changed your market, but instead extinguish you.
Nice. I think that's a great place to wrap this up, because that's some strong advice. And I think that will be a conversation, if not the conversation, moving forward in firms, in management meetings in these next months and years. I know in Copenhagen, where I was at, that was already a conversation constantly of how do we embrace this? How do we integrate this? How do we, in a world where we need to deliver things that do work, how do we start working with these tools that maybe aren't quite where we need them to be yet? But we know, like you said, we know that they will be soon. And we know that we will need to be making adjustments. And I think the more organic and paced you can make those adjustments, the smoother the transition will be. And also just the more value you can add to your own work and to the client work. So cool. Great. Nigel, anything else? You got the AI thing in. We touched on diversity a little bit. I think we probably could have spent a little more time on that. But we'll be sure to link your podcast and maybe Bo's work too. The SIP stuff I think would be great. And anything else that this has just been such a valuable conversation, and I hope that folks will get a lot from the conversation and also open up a lot of new paths for them to explore and think through and consider as they're moving about their careers. So thank you.
No, I think I'm good. Thank you very much for the invitation. I very much enjoyed the conversation.
Really appreciate the time, as always, and so nice to talk to you. Our lovely theme music is provided and composed by Damon Smile. Check them out wherever you get your music. Field Notes from Abroad is separate from my current role and reflects my views and the views of my guests only. It should not be construed as legal advice. You can connect with us on the socials at Field Notes from Abroad, and I'm always delighted to receive your ideas, feedback, or questions. And of course, if you like today's show, please leave the show a 5-star review wherever you're listening. This helps others find the show and connects them with ideas and conversations that may spur their professional development and curiosity. Thanks again for listening to Field Notes from Abroad. I'll see you on the next episode.